Yes, thank you so much, Hannah, and welcome to you all to this first meeting, real meeting, topic-related meeting in the newly established real estate and practice group. I've been looking forward to this meeting very much, and have spent a little bit of time arranging it together with Hannah and Ben, which will have a speech later on today. So thank you all you guys for making this possible, and thank you to all the other ones here for joining. I hope that this will be one meeting in a succession of many more, where we can meet and discuss topics and business opportunities in relation to real estate and construction in our firms. I very much look forward to also receiving your input on what you would like to discuss during these meetings, and also the format and so forth. We are very open to suggestions and hope you will tip in. Anyway, the agenda that Hannah sent out has 5 items. The first is a welcome and introduction. This is ongoing, and then the second item is a speech by my colleague Nikolaj Kromann-Hellesen about the EU Commission's proposal to revise the energy performance of buildings directive. A directive which was issued in 2021, or a proposal that was issued in 2021, and which imposes and will impose, if enacted in this present form, very stricter and a forced timeline on requirements on building emissions throughout the EU. A very interesting topic and very top of the agenda here in Denmark. I'm sure in other member states as well. Then Ben Stansfield of Gowling has kindly offered to make a speech with the interesting title, Making the Case for Nature. Ben will elaborate more on that. I understand that one of the topics in England is that they have new rules over there, which have come into force late last year, which requires all developments to result in at least a 10% gain in biodiversity. And I'm sure Ben will inform us more about this exciting topic. Then the fourth item is topics members would like to discuss in 2023, and there I hope you will tip in, as I said. And then last item is networking, time permitting. And as regards time permitting, then I know that both Nikolaj and Ben have prepared speeches that will take not less than 20 minutes, any of them, either of them. So instead of me talking, I just want to complete my welcome and introductions here and now, and then I think we should get on with the agenda and move directly to item 2, which will be my very talented colleague Nikolaj Kromann-Hellesen, who will present what we know about the EU's latest proposal on the Buildings Directive. So Nikolaj, can you take it away from here? And I know you have a presentation, and then after Nikolaj's speech, we can maybe open up shortly for a few questions. So Nikolaj, on to you.
Thank you so much, Jens. You should be able to see my presentation now. And as mentioned, it will concern the proposal of a new energy performance of buildings directive, abbreviated to EPBD, which is very difficult to say, so I will say directive from now on. And my name is, as Jens mentioned, Nikolaj Kromann-Hellesen. I'm a senior associate in Bech-Bruun law firm in Denmark. And furthermore, after I've spoken a bit about the new directive, I would like to entertain you a bit about a minor perspective to some new national Danish rules regarding requirements for life cycle assessments in new buildings, which are also covered by the directive, with a maximum limit of CO2 emissions for larger buildings. And these Danish rules have entered into force a month ago on the 1st of January 2023, trying to take into account some of the new requirements of the not yet valid directive. So the directive. A bit about the background. As many of you dealing with ESG probably already have heard in some presentation or read somewhere, buildings are responsible for approximately 40% of the EU energy consumption and for 36% of the energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, buildings are actually the single largest energy consumer in Europe, and heating, cooling, and domestic hot water accounts for about 80% of the energy that we actually as citizens consume. At present, we have about 35% of the buildings in EU who are over 50 years old, and almost 75% of the building stock is actually energy inefficient. And looking at the rate of the renovation, we're not doing that well. It's only about 1% of the building stock that is renovated each year. So for this reason, the EU authorities, they have proposed a revision of the building directive with some increased energy requirements. The proposal is from December 2021, but we find it very relevant right now because they actually expect to have a finished directive this year in 2023. And that's why we've chosen it as a topic for today. With this proposal, the Commission, they aim to change the existing regulatory framework to reflect higher ambitions and more pressing needs regarding climate actions. And at the same time, the directive aims to take into account the diversity and differences in the building stocks areas. So, as you can see here, I've listed member state concerns, and there are many concerns and a lot of criticism. That's probably also the reason why it's taken them so long to actually get it to enter into force. From a Danish perspective, we see that 1.2 million Danish homes with the worst energy labels will be potentially be forced to complete an energy renovation before 2033. Also, there have been many Italian concerns. As you might know, in Italy, there's a lot of old buildings and many historical buildings, and therefore Italy actually perceives themselves as the biggest loser from this proposed reform. They assess that about 9 million buildings would not meet these standards. And right now, 35% of all buildings in Italy have what we call a G rating. I'll get back to that later, but it's the G rating buildings that has to be renovated to a higher label. So 35% of buildings, of course, the Italians are very concerned with this. And there has, of course, been many other expressed concerns other than the Danish and the Italian. And this is the reason why the proposed directive continues to be negotiated among the EU Commission and the member states. So a bit about the main measures in this new proposal, kind of an overview. The first measure is a gradual introduction of some minimum energy performance standards, which has to trigger renovation of the existing worst performing buildings. And this proposed measure will increase the rate of renovation, particularly for the worst performing buildings in each member state, which is mentioned, and we'll get back to later. The second measure is what we've already seen with some regulations in Denmark, and that's a new standard for new buildings and a more ambitious vision for buildings. Of course, it's different what we have to renovate and what we have to perform for the new buildings. It's easier for the new buildings to take into account the different environmental and sustainable requirements. So when it comes to existing buildings and renovation, the goal is that the building mass in all member states must be climate neutral before the year of 2050. And for zero emission buildings is actually required from 2030 already. And for public entity buildings is already from 2027, whereas the plan that new buildings will have to perform according to the zero emission criteria. Furthermore, there's some requirements regarding long-term renovation strategies. So each member state will have to have a national building renovation plan aiming at decarbonizing the national building stocks by 2050. So this zero emission policy. And then there has to be some indicative milestones for 2030 and 2040, and then finally for 2050. The strategies, they will need to include some roadmaps for phasing out fossil fuels as well in heating and cooling by 2040 at the latest. The fourth measure concerns energy performance certificates, also known as the EPCs, which you might already know and have heard of. And these EPCs, they must provide some information to consumers on buildings that the consumers plan to buy and rent. So, and that is in relation to the energy performance ratings. And it's kind of the intention that these EPCs must be disclosed in all advertisements when a building is put up for sale or rent, so the consumer can actually make a smart choice when choosing where they want to rent or own a building. The fifth measure is a definition of deep renovation and the introduction of building renovation passports. Deep renovation, it will be defined as renovation that transforms buildings into these zero emission buildings, which is the rating A that I will revert to in a second. And the building renovation passport is a document outlining a long-term step-by-step renovation roadmap. So you can actually, as an owner, see what you have to do to get up to the greatest level at the zero emission level. And then the sixth and final measure is a modernization of buildings and the systems and better energy system integration. Heating. Yes, so heating, cooling. I'm sorry, I think there's someone who should mute. Thank you. So sixth measure is modernization of buildings and the systems, so heating, cooling, ventilation, and of course charging of electrical vehicles, which is very important and a big political focus in Denmark as well. So to sum it all up, the EU's ambition is that all buildings must be greener and consume far less energy, and it kind of corresponds to the climate plan Fit for 55. And the plan Repower EU, which aims to make Europe independent of Russian gas. And now for the new European energy label scale. So the EU Commission have in its proposal made a new harmonized European energy label scale for all EU member states. And the new energy label is valid for the entire EU, but they are not finalized this at all yet. They have given themselves a deadline for 2025, so we can get the specific requirements to see whether you're in listing B or D or E or F or G and so on. But the main purpose here is to ensure that individual member states that their efforts comply with the directive's minimum requirements for the energy performance of buildings. So these new requirements, which I will get back to on the next slide, and also, of course, so that some sort of comparison can be made across the different member states and how far they are with their goals. And this new energy label scale, as you can see here, it categorizes properties into energy classes from A to G. And actually, this is quite a big work because, as you can see from the slide, this classification has to be performed by the individual member states. So, of course, there's a big task in play to actually categorizing every single building in the different member countries. And that's up to the member states to find out how to do so if they're not already done something similar. And as you can see, the energy class A is zero emission buildings. There's already some definitions for this because new buildings will have to live up to that standard. And then we have for the energy class G, which is the 15% of buildings that have the worst average energy performance in the EU building stock. As for the rest, we'll have to wait and see how this plays out in the final directive and the Commission's detailed documents, which has to be finalized by 2025. Okay, so now when we look at new buildings and these minimum energy performance standards, it follows from the directive that Article 7, that all member states shall ensure that all newly constructed buildings are zero emission buildings in accordance with Annex 3. And I've also put something in from Annex 3. So that is the Class A. And the deadlines, as you can see, are pretty strict. From the 1st of January 27, new buildings occupied or owned by public authorities must be this zero emission. And as of 1st January 2030, all new buildings will have to be this. Of course, this is the proposal from the end of 2011, so maybe there will be some revision to these dates since it has taken them so long, as it usually does in the EU. But this is what we know for now. Furthermore, if you look at Article 7, it actually also states an obligation to, in general, calculate life cycle global warming potential. So a life cycle assessment. And this life cycle assessment applies to actually from 1st January 27, all new buildings with a usable floor area larger than 2,000 square meters, and from 2030 for all new buildings. So that's the general life cycle assessment, and these are the minimum requirements that they have to be zero emission from these dates. And as you can see from Annex 3, there have been a division into the different climatic zones: the Mediterranean, the Oceanic, the continental, and the Nordic, depending on what the requirements are. And in addition to this, there's also a requirement to the energy consumption if you want to have a zero emission building. So the total annual primary energy use of a new or renovated zero emission building shall be fully covered by either energy from renewable sources generated on site, or by renewable energy provided from a renewable energy community, or renewable energy and waste heat from an efficient district heating and cooling system. So that's kind of the focus. Also, as I just mentioned about the independence from Russian gas, and of course also general fossil fuels. There has to be some renewable energy sources if we can actually hit this zero emission. There is, of course, a general exemption to all of this, and that is where it's technically not feasible to fulfill these requirements for the renewable source energy, and that will be up to the individual member states to specify how they can be acquired in some other way. So it says that it should be covered by energy from the grid, complying with criteria established at national level. Okay, so this is for the new buildings and the zero emission requirement. Also, when we come to, and then when we go to existing buildings, it's here that we have had much criticism from many member states. So in Article 9 of the directive, it follows that the buildings owned or used by public authorities must have energy label F by 2027. So as you can see, the focus is these worst performing buildings in rating G, where Italian actually had 35% of its building mass, but they have to be increased to level F after 1st of January 2027. And after 1st of January, and that's of course for the for 2030, it has to be energy performance class E, and that is for the public bodies. And then we have for the non-residential building units here, as well as residential buildings. That's what I mentioned about that it was in 2033 that these residential buildings might be hitting some difficulties. Other than these deadlines, it follows that member states shall establish specific timelines for the mentioned buildings to achieve higher energy performance, so higher than F in the performance classes by 2040 and 2050. So there will come some national rules regarding a phase-in time for stricter requirements. Of course, there are always exceptions to the main rule, and one of the exceptions to Article 9's requirements are listed in subsection 5, and it follows from this subsection that member states have the right to refrain from applying the minimum energy performance standards to a list of specific buildings. And that's where I use the Italian example all the time, but that's where the Italian might take some comfort, because one of them can be buildings that are protected as a part of designated because of their special architectural or historical merit. So maybe some of the building mass can be put into that exemption. Also, there are buildings used as religious activities, temporary buildings, and minor buildings with a useful floor area of less than 50 square meters. So as mentioned, these deadlines are not final and seem pretty strict for the existing masses at least. But let's see what the EU comes up with this, what the Commission comes up with this year, together with the member states, and what national legislation we will have. So as mentioned, it's all general guidelines and framework, as it is a directive, and we'll have to see what the member states within this framework, what rules they assign. And of course, we'll always have to ask ourselves, why is this important to us? Well, since we know that this directive is most likely will be adopted, we here at Bech-Bruun at least are already in the process of informing our clients regarding these upcoming requirements. Of course, we cannot state what the final requirements or deadlines will be, but when our clients are renovating their properties, we inform them of this upcoming directive, so they can at least try to take this into account, which of course is a bit difficult since we don't have the final labels. But if they renovate their properties, which are in rating G, they can at least try to improve and look at the general sustainability and the EU taxonomy to try to improve it. Just briefly onto the next one, which is a Danish perspective. And as mentioned, on January 1st, 2023, we have these new climate requirements for new buildings. And for all new buildings, we have to perform an LCA analysis, the life cycle assessment, just as you saw in the directive. Now, for all buildings above 1,000 square meters, there is a limit value. We don't allocate it to kilowatts as they do in the directives Annex 3, but we have a view of kilograms of CO2 equivalents per square meter per year. And of course, if they're under this 1,000 square meter requirement, there's no limit value, but only a requirement for LCA calculations. And then if you want to be extra ambitious, you can go into the voluntary low emission class. The exceptions to these new requirements are that renovation are not covered. It's only new buildings. And as for the EU directive, civil works is not covered either. Of course, there are some specific exceptions as well, for example, for extensions and temporary mobile pavilions and summer houses, and etc. And it's quite interesting because you actually have to fulfill these requirements of the LCA analysis and the limit value for larger buildings if you want to get a permission to use your building. So of course, that's quite an incentive to actually get this done properly. And as you can see, unfortunately, this is in Danish, but I guess you can see that we have kind of a phase-in requirement. So for 2023 is these 12 kilograms, and then we expect it to be 10.5, 9, and 7.5 to actually make it more ambitious when the whole when everyone has adopted to these new requirements. And of course, we also expect that the new directive will affect the upcoming regulation in Danish law. So I guess my time is up. And if you have any questions, comments, please feel free.
Yes, please feel free to ask Nikolaj any questions, or we can maybe take around questions when we heard Ben's speak also. Anyone with questions to Nikolaj? No. Well, but as Nikolaj said, this is a really important piece of upcoming legislation that all building owners and all investors should be fully aware of, that there will be requirements as to emission of buildings going forward. That goes for new builds as well as in investments in existing properties. These are highly important topics that there are a lot of money involved in, and also a lot of opportunity for rendering legal advice for us as lawyers. So this is why we at Bækbrun at least are looking very closely at it. Anyway, thank you, Nikolaj. That was really interesting. And now I will switch over to you, Ben. Please take it away.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I shall just share my screen. Hopefully that's come up.
Yes,
perfect.
It has.
Great stuff. Thank you. So, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I'm Ben. I am a consenting and environmental lawyer. So I've snuck into the real estate meeting today. So thank you very much for having me. And I'm going to talk about making the case for nature. So I'm spending a lot of my time talking to my real estate developer clients and investors as well about some new rules in England about biodiversity, which I think is a bit of a global pathfinder. So I'd be interested to know if you have similar rules in your jurisdictions. If not, you know what's coming your way, because we are very excited about this in England. But I'm going to set the scene first, if I can get my computer to work. Right. So apologies to my American colleagues on the line, but I'm going to start by telling you a story about when I was in Salt Lake City last year. And I saw these clementines, these small oranges, which had been peeled and put in a plastic container. And it made me question two things. First of all, how did nature not think of a perfect container for oranges? A missed trick there. And secondly, it kind of made me think, well, we're doomed as a society if this is the kind of thing we're doing. And so I wrote a piece on LinkedIn about this. And actually, one of my American friends said, Ben, you're being a bit hard here, because actually this is really important for people with disabilities and what have you, who would otherwise struggle to eat fruit. So I'm starting out with a message that mankind doesn't always treat nature with the respect that we should. So I'm going to set the scene by talking about the global biodiversity crisis, talk about the Professor Dasgupta review in the UK, who talked about why biodiversity in nature was important for economic reasons. My case study on biodiversity net gain, I could talk about that for an hour or two, but don't worry, Jens, I've got my timer on, so I won't. Nature on the board. So this is where environmental law or nature and lawyers come together and do cool things. I really, really wish it was me who had come up with this idea, but I'm not going to tell you about it yet. It's exciting and it will come your way. And then finally, I'll just talk about why nature is the new carbon, why board directors are taking nature seriously. So the global biodiversity crisis, you can see 10,000 years ago, which I think is at the top of the screen, so that we'd just sort of come to the end of the Stone Age. We were all living very peacefully. obviously lots of freshwater lakes, mountains, all this kind of stuff. But of the usable land, nearly 60%, 57% of it was forest, and 42% of it was wild grassland. And biodiversity was thriving. The butterflies were happy, the birds, everything was doing really well. We probably even had wolves and bears in the UK as well. 5,000 years ago, that's the time of the pyramids, so still a very long time ago. And you can see that little pink sliver. So mankind had started to farm and was shaping, putting their stamp on the environment. And then you can fast forward to 2018, and you can see that we have had massive degradation of our natural environment. Forests, we've lost a third of them. Wild grassland and scrubland, we have lost 2/3. And what have we replaced it with? Well, only 1% of the usable land is urban. So the next time or our clients, our real estate developer clients, are accused of ruining the world, we can tell them with confidence that actually no, the built environment is only 1%. Now, actually, you can blame the farmers, or you can even blame the meat eaters, because 1/3 of our land is used for grazing animals. You can see 15% crops. So that's the crops that are used to sustain us. That's food that we're eating. But we use 1/3 of our land now to feed animals, so and graze them, which we then eat. So there's pollution associated with farming. There are greenhouse gases, and I've been vegan for about 12 years, so I'm really itching not to tell you about the ethics of it all. But if you want to save the planet, go vegan. So you can see that, yeah, biodiversity crisis, this is why, because this is how we are using our land. Right, the Dasgupta review. Now, I should say these little photos I'm very proud of, because last year I did what we call no mow May. So I decided not to cut the grass on my lawn. And I put some wildflower seeds down and then sort of sat back, drank a lot of beer over the summer, and this is what came out instead. So these are little vignettes from my garden, and you'll see these photos throughout because I use them excessively. So Professor Dasgupta is an economist at Cambridge University, and he wrote a quite tremendous report about the economics of biodiversity. If you are a super nerd, there is the full report, that's 900 pages. If you're nerdish, there is an executive summary, which is about 100 pages. And if you're super lazy, there is a 10 to 15 page report. That was the one for journalists. That's the one to read. It's really, really good. And in the report, Professor Dasgupta, I mean, it's no surprise, he says that biodiversity is really important. Everything depends on nature. Our whole food and drink industries depend on pollination, because without that, we don't get our food growing. The furniture industry is really completely dependent on woods and forests and all this kind of stuff. So he basically says so much of the global economy is dependent on nature. We're globally living completely unsustainably at 1.6 Earths, really obviously impacting future generations, and we haven't really thought how we're going to deal with nature. So what he concludes is, I guess that's the bumblebee at the end, that financial institutions and businesses should report on their dependencies and impacts on nature. We should tell our stakeholders, our customers, our employees, our lenders, our investors, what we are doing to nature and what we would do without nature. And what's really, really important about the Professor Dasgupta review is that it wasn't commissioned by a left-wing vegan think tank, who I would get very excited about. It was commissioned by HM Treasury, so the financial institution of the British government. That's how important it was felt. And it's had quite a big impact on our policies. And I'm going to tell you about biodiversity net gain, which Jens highlighted. So this came into, well, this was brought in legislation in 2021. We've been talking about it for 18 months to 2 years, but the legislation finally got passed. And the biodiversity net gain rules come into force in November this year. So a lot of my clients who have got big development schemes, which are likely to get consent from November onwards, they're starting to plan how they do biodiversity net gain now. And I'll talk about some of the options. But it's impacting every single developer. So whether you are doing logistics, whether you're a house builder, whether you're building power stations, bridges, airports, whatever you're doing, it impacts you. And as I say, if it goes well, it's coming your way, I'm sure. So what does it mean? So every development has to have a mandatory minimum 10% gain on new developments. There are some rules which allow you to undertake permitted development. So that's the PD in my brackets. I should have taken that off. But permitted development. So if you're doing a small extension to your house, if you're doing a modest change and so forth, you don't need to do this. But any other development, you'll need to increase your biodiversity on site. So there is a technical metric published by the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. They've published this phenomenally complex biodiversity metric, which I haven't got a clue what it means. It is you need to be a scientist to understand it. But essentially, you plug in all the data, the baseline biodiversity condition of your site. You plug in what you're developing, where it is, all this kind of stuff. And it will tell you how many biodiversity units your current site has and how many, therefore, you need to produce. So you have to either develop biodiversity units by doing works on site, or you have to go ultimately and buy biodiversity units from a third party, or if the worst comes to worst, you have to purchase credits from the Secretary of State. So it's going to be the Secretary of State being government. So it's a little bit like emissions trading in that sense. There are going to be rules to make sure that you do not degrade the biodiversity on your site before you submit your application for development consent. So you can't decide, I've got my site, it's rich in biodiversity, I want to redevelop it, so I'm going to chop down all the hedges, all the trees, put down loads of pesticides, fertilizers. I'm going to really screw nature over, and then I'm going to apply. Can't do that. There are going to be rules around that. And very strict rules that you have to maintain this biodiversity, these works for at least 30 years, which is pretty, it sounds like a short time, but actually it's quite, you know, there's a new legal mechanism called a conservation covenant that has come into force, and those will be used to secure the works. And I think a lot of my clients had hoped they could do these works, and they could provide a bond, they could, you know, hand some money over, and it's someone else's problem. But that's really the worst thing that could happen here. So there's going to be a really quite significant long tail onerous liability that developers will have for 30 years. So they need to think about how to manage that, so that if there is a storm in year 7, the next day they're back on site restoring the biodiversity to give the results that we need. A biodiversity gain plan has to be approved before you can commence. So you get your planning permission, your consent from the municipality, and you will have to then write a plan which will have to be approved before you can start work. And I've spoken about conservation covenants. How can this be achieved? Now, before we go any further, could you all just take a moment to marvel at my PowerPoint skills? Every single shape, every window has been hand drawn with PowerPoint shapes, and I'm very proud of it. Almost as proud of this as my wildflower. So if you are a developer in an urban location, it is likely that the local authority will tell you to put the biodiversity on site, on the building. And you might have a very small site, you might be really, you know, the land's going to be worth a lot of money, so you don't want to be putting too much of the greenery, the flowers and so forth on the ground where your car parks and what have you will be. So you'll have pressure to put it on the structure. Some of my clients are really upset about that and really worried, because obviously that has an impact in terms of the structure. So I've got a client who does last mile logistics in London, and you know, having a green roof and green walls will dramatically increase the cost. There'll be water ingress, all this kind of stuff. So they're not particularly keen on this option. If you have more land, for example, you're building houses in the regions, you might want to put your biodiversity work, your biodiversity land within your development site, but that will impact on the developable area, because this is going to be quite a sizable piece of biodiversity. And you might say, that whilst putting it on site mitigates the local loss. So you have a field, you develop that field for housing, the biodiversity should be replaced in situ, right? And so you'll get lots of these little, what we call postage stamps, small areas of biodiversity works throughout. Now, if you were an insect, is this the kind of site you would want to go to, where there are going to be 300 cats, 200 dogs, 500 children, and people driving their cars, Amazon vans, in and out of the estate all day? Possibly not. So maybe on-site biodiversity gain is not always going to be the best solution. We might put our biodiversity works next door. This means that we might be able to charge our residents as part of their estate charge for the upkeep of these works for the next 30 years, because it's going to be nearby. It will be mitigation within the area. So that's good. And if, for example, you are a solar farm developer or a wind farm developer, you might want to have your biodiversity works slightly off-site, owned perhaps by a different entity, so that you can then sell your wind farm into a fund, get financing, all that kind of stuff, without a funder or an investor worried about what kind of liabilities you've got long-term. If you wanted to, you could put your off-site works, or rather, if you could persuade the municipality to accept this, you could do your off-site works maybe a few kilometers away from your site. Now, the biodiversity metric means that the further away from your impact site, so where your development is, if you put your biodiversity works 300 kilometers away, you're going to have to do a lot more. So there is a distance issue here. The legislation allows for offsetting at the other side of the country, but I think it's going to be very, very difficult to persuade a local authority to give you development consent when you're offsetting so far away. They're going to want it locally. Now, this is a new business model that we're seeing come up, the off-site habitat land bank. So I have a client who is acquiring land all over England, and what they're going to do is they say, we are a specialist ecology developer. So we're going to produce these habitat land banks, and these are going to be very, very significant sizes. And we will do all the ecology works, the biodiversity improvements, and we will sell units to developers in the municipality, and they can use those units to offset their scheme. Now, I think these are going to be very popular, and they're going to be it's going to be a big industry in England. It's completely new. But it means that there'll be specialists doing it. And again, going back to our butterfly, our insect, who's going to be attacked by dogs, cats, footballs, cars every day. This will be an oasis. This will be a wonderful place to be an insect. So you'll get some really good biodiverse, free from the horrors of children and our pets. Option 6, final option, is that you can purchase credits from the Secretary of State. So if all else fails, you can buy your way out of trouble. These will be expensive. We are still waiting for lots of regulation, lots of guidance. We're still trying to make it up as we go along, but there is a feeling that 10% gains doesn't really make a massive difference, doesn't improve things, but it stops the damage. So we expect it to go to 12%, 15, 20% in years to come. I think it's going to be a bit messy to start with, but it's exciting for the future. Right, nature on the board. I really built this up a few minutes ago. I wasn't involved. Faith in Nature is a cosmetics business in the north of England, and it does lots of sort of plant-based stuff, lots of plastic-free shampoos, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's a really cool business. And what they wanted, what they've done is they've put nature onto the board of directors. And I'll explain briefly how they've done that. But what's even more impressive is that they've produced this open source guide. There's a 10-page document on their website which explains how they've done it. And it obviously goes into much more detail. And I just think it is the most special thing I've read in a long time. So what they've done is they've amended their objects clause. So they've said, the purpose of this business obviously to make money and all this kind of stuff, and we've got to have regard to the environment, but we've got to have a specific regard to nature and biodiversity. Then they have appointed a non-executive director to the board. And so they have appointed, I think it's Lawyers for Nature, sort of a charity, an NGO, or it could be anyone, you know, local wildlife group or whoever. And every so often there'll be a rotation that, you know, an individual from the entity turns up to be the nominee, the nature nominee. The rules of the company, the articles have been amended so that the nature garden, the director who's looking after nature and speaking for nature at board meetings has to attend. And if a nature reserved matter, is circle number 4, which they've defined as any sort of decision that would have an obvious impact on nature, on habitats, on water, then that meeting can't go ahead unless the nature guardian, the nature director, is there. That nature guardian can take expert advice paid for by the company. And what's my final circle? The business has said that when we act contrary to the advice and the decision of the nature guardian, we have to explain this in our report. We have a transparency duty, and we'll put this on our website and put in our annual report. So I haven't found any other business globally which has done this, and I think it's absolutely fantastic, and I suspect this will be the tip of the iceberg, and we'll see this more and more. So to conclude, we're speaking to a lot of clients about ESG. I'm sure you are too. And actually, Gowling itself is working out our own ESG strategy, and we're trying to have some nature objectives. And we started those last year we had a biodiversity essay competition. So all the graduates, well, we put on our website 500 words, please. You know, what role do lawyers have in biodiversity? And we had such a really strong interest from Gen Z graduates and what have you. So we're starting to find ways where we can talk about nature with our clients. Here are my pictures again. So on the top line, we have got why I think nature is the new carbon. So we've been talking, so my theory on this is we've been talking about net zero, we've been talking about decarbonisation, all this kind of stuff, net zero by 2040, by 2050, whatever. And it's really important, but it's a kind of a weird message, because what we're saying when we say that is we're going to stop polluting. If carbon is a pollutant, we're going to stop polluting in 25 years. Aren't we amazing? And you think, well, that's good, but it's not a great story. You could do something now. And nature is a really good way that businesses can do something now. So I talked about the optics, you know, how good does that really look? Obviously, we've had lockdown, you know, COVID, we've sort of stopped traveling and we spent time exploring our own communities. So I think there's a much more strong appreciation of nature at the moment. COP15 was so we talk about COP25 in Paris, COP26 in Glasgow, COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh. We're kind of familiar with those climate conferences, but COP15 was last October, November last year in Montreal, and it was on biodiversity. Same sort of thing. But the fact that we were talking about COP15 on the news, I thought was pretty exciting, because we're talking about nature conferences on primetime TV, which we hadn't before. The TNFD, so you'll probably be familiar with the TCFD, the climate-related financial disclosures, which are now in full force and starting to be incorporated into national law. We're now talking about nature disclosures, and I think that's going to start happening in a couple of years as well. And I've talked about the extent of policy from government. There's so much noise. Last week, the UK government published a 250-page nature policy, which has got so much good and exciting things in there. On Friday, Natural England published guidance for green infrastructure. So there's loads of noise from government. It's really exciting. So on the bottom row, I've put what businesses now need to start thinking about. And they've got to assess their impact on nature. You know, Professor Dasgupta reminded us that everything comes back to the nature. So think about, as a business, what impact you're having in terms of local biodiversity, but also things like how much water you're abstracting and using in your business. Consider the nature positive options. So instead of using concrete to build your houses, you know, what about sustainable timbers and things like that, which is something in the UK we haven't really done for many hundreds of years. So we're now starting to think about, well, developers are thinking about more sustainable materials and having sustainable forestries and so forth. We're suggesting businesses think about, yeah, what if your nature services ended? You know, what if you could no longer rely on natural pollinators? What would happen to your business there? some of our clients are starting to buy nature credits. So even if they're not caught up in the biodiversity net gain rules because they don't come into force in November, they're starting to think about doing some nature offsets. And we know that offsets are problematic, and carbon offsetting has got all sorts of issues with it, but it's something. And then again, reporting and disclosure, there's a lot of mandatory carbon reporting, but we're really encouraging clients, and some of the bigger ones are biting and getting excited about it in terms of voluntary reporting of their nature impacts. And that is a picture of me looking tired. So I shall stop sharing and hand the microphone back to you, Jens.
Thank you very much, Ben. Very, very interesting and inspiring talk. And the two topics have worked well together, I think, and have supplemented each other in a very good manner, where we've gone from being very real estate oriented and specific on legislation and requirements that we are looking at will be part of our reality and common regime within a few years, I'm sure. And then taking it on in your talk, Ben, to the more broader perspective of ESG in any kind of business that is operated all over the world and by our clients, and thinking the strategy of ESG and how to preserve nature into all business decisions. So in that respect, it's been really useful and interesting with these two talks. So maybe before I thank both of you guys, I just want to hear from the participants. Are there any questions or comments to Nikolaj or Ben? Then please feel free to raise a hand and speak out. No one. Well, then we'll move on. Thank you again, Nikolaj and Ben, also for very interesting talks about these topics that are really interesting and very important. And as I said, will open up a lot of business opportunities for us as lawyers as well moving forward. But it requires that we are on the top of our game and are following the developments within the legislation, both domestically and also internationally. For those of us, Ben, that are still a part of the EU, of course, still Brussels has a lot to say, and we of course looking very much looking much for what is going on down there. So it's of course very important for us. Thank you so much. Then moving on to the next item on the agenda, and that is topics for coming meetings in 2023. Are there anyone who wants to chip in with the topics that we could discuss? You can do it now, or you can also be done by sending an email to me or to Hannah, and we will take them into account as well. I personally think that the ESG agenda is so big and so interesting that it is certainly worthwhile a revisit on different angles to it. So I will at least have that in mind on preparing for the next meeting and making the agenda for that. And don't be surprised if I or Hannah reaches out to you, one of you, to hear if anyone feels for making a speech during a group meeting. That would be fantastic to hear some local experiences and hear about how things are dealt with in other jurisdictions. So anyone with the topics for upcoming meetings? No, that's all right. We will, as I said, my email, my inbox is open 24 hours. So so please feel free to send me an email and or Hannah, and we will make sure to have an interesting agenda for the next meeting as well.
Yes, and I just like to jump in, Jens. I know we have a number of folks from the Asia Pacific region today. As I mentioned, even some of our folks from New Zealand, it's quite late there. We are happy to work with you on scheduling a bit more of a convenient time for you so that you're not on at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock or 2 a.m. So if there is a topic that you want to discuss, we're more than happy to work with you on creating a better time to host that discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Hannah. Of course, that goes without saying. We will try to be flexible and arrange the meetings sometimes where we are taking turns, so to speak, compared to where we are in the world. Sure. Anyway, that leaves us only with the last topic, and that is networking, time permitting. And Hannah, I'm not sure how you want to do this or whether we have 2 minutes left. So I think we can say that the networking is done has been done already, more or less.
Yes, I think we can, maybe for the next meeting, add 15 minutes on at the end. So typically how we do the networking when we have a larger group is that I break everyone into a room so that they have a one-on-one or a two-on-one meeting to get to know members a little bit. We did with the speed networking for the previous session that we had with this group last fall. So we can definitely table that and put it on the agenda for the next meeting.
Well, Alexander,
I'd like to, first of all, thank you very much, Jens, for taking over this leadership role. Thank you very much, Hannah, for coordinating all that. Just one question, with MIPIM coming up in March, are you planning to set up anything there, or should we just very casually try to find a slot on the ground? But what's your plan?
So, Alexander, what I plan to do for MIPIM is I'll send an email to everyone in this group, not just who attended today, but to the group as a whole to find out who's attending. And if it becomes something that we have a large group and there's a time slot that works for everyone, we'll try to arrange something, some sort of formal meetup. Otherwise, what we've done in the past, someone at the MIPIM conference has just found a bar or a place for everyone to meet up for 45 minutes before dinner. So we do plan to find out who's attending it and share that list with everyone.
Yeah,
great, thanks.
Alexander, I'm sure we'll see each other down there. I'll be there from Tuesday to Friday, and I'm sure you will be there for a few days as well. My thought was maybe to find, as Hannah said, a cafe or somewhere where those WLG members who are attending can meet up and have a coffee or whatever and meet. So you'll certainly hear from us on that. And apart from that, I look forward to seeing you in more warm and pleasurable surroundings in Cannes in March.